All right. Well, welcome everyone. I am so glad that you're here, and I want to begin by thanking you for being part of this series to whatever extent you have been on racism in America classes, as together we have explored our country's history, much of which we did not learn in school. As we've seen during our time together, much of the racial turmoil in our country today can be traced directly to elements of our history, even before the founding of the United States. Many of the racial stereotypes that we hear or hold ourselves are a direct consequence of intentional public and economic policy and cultural beliefs that have no grounding in genetics. Now that we more deeply understand the history of our country and the myriad ways that bigotry and discrimination are embedded in our society, we turn our attention to the most important question. So what are we going to do about it? We have seen much about our country's history in these weeks that cry out for action, for reform. Much of the historic economic discrimination will take decades or longer to address in comprehensive ways. But we have it within our ability to take meaningful action on issues of criminal justice and voting rights reform, alleviating poverty, addressing inequity in education. It is essential that we do so, that we make our voices heard so that theirs may be heard as well. And there's another aspect of action that is less concrete, but equally important. One that addresses our personal beliefs that are based on our individual histories, our families, our education, our experience. Examining those beliefs, surfacing what is called unconscious bias, implicit bias, is an important step in our ability to identify and counter racism in its many manifestations. Our class today will take what we have learned and use it as a catalyst for action. I have some thoughts to share with you, and I look forward to hearing your perspectives as we engage in a meaningful path forward to a more just and equitable society. Together, we will look ahead to use our deeper understanding of our country's history to shape our future actions as we indeed seek justice and peace for all. As is our custom, we'll start with a quick recap of last week's class, where we looked at the legal history of voting rights, understand the 15th Amendment and what happened at the end of Reconstruction, and then how we observed literally a century of voter suppression tactics that led up to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and then subsequently the Supreme Court decision in 2013 on Shelby v. Holder that dismantled the Voting Rights Act of 1965. A question came up last week as to the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act, which sought to replace the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It was introduced in 2017. It had 223 sponsors. When it came up for a vote in Congress, it passed on party lines, 219 to 217. And when it went to the Senate, it could not pass the filibuster threshold, the cloture vote of 60 votes. And so no action was ever taken in the session. It remains approved by the House, and it requires session action for anything further to occur. We looked last week at the actions that have taken place in the recent assault on voting rights via the use of voter ID laws, voter roll purges, limiting resources, and a continuing effort to restrict the ability of people of color to be able to cast their vote in United States elections. So that will be part of the work to address going forward. So since all of you were not part of all of the classes, just a brief summary. Our first class was the early years from 1619 to 1865, the end of the Civil War. Then our second class looked at a period that we've called slavery by another name, from Reconstruction through the passage of Black codes, the system of convict leasing, the horrific segregation associated with Jim Crow laws that was enforced by horrific violence. In our third class, we moved into the 20th century looking at key elements of public policy and the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Our fourth class dealt with the criminal justice system as we considered our state of mass incarceration and the consequences of the war on drugs. Last week, voter suppression then and now, and today, importantly, perhaps most importantly, where do we go from here? To recap some definitions that were discussed in our very first class, that prejudice is an unfavorable opinion formed often without personal knowledge. And that is where we see the most significant impact of the Jim Crow laws that kept us separated, Black from white, during that period of time when virtually all forms of social interaction were illegal. White supremacy is not explicitly the tiki torch carrying, chanting protesters, but it is a belief held at whatever conscious or unconscious level that white people are inherently superior to people from other racial groups and are therefore rightfully the ones who are dominant in any society. And we know there are people who believe this unilaterally across the board, and there are others of us who have thoughts when faced with a racial choice that perhaps white is superior to Black. Racism is discrimination directed against a group of people based on their membership in a racial group. But it is not just thoughts or feelings or words or attitudes. Racism is a system of prejudice backed by power. And we have seen the ways in which laws and judicial decisions and other elements of the leadership of our country have enforced a system of racism in America. And we have seen the numerous ways that white power has been exercised throughout our history. So today we're shifting our attention from our history to our future, to use our deeper understanding of our past to shape our future actions. And so in order to do that, we start by asking, what have we learned? What is it that we know now that we didn't know before? And then knowing those elements, how are we affected by this new knowledge? How are we different? What do we see differently than we might have in the past? Is it possible that we are now able to more clearly see a pattern of white supremacy, of discrimination? And then, importantly, what do we need to do individually and collectively? And might we feel a new or renewed urgency to act given the depth and breadth of the discrimination that continues? So what we learned is that the institution of slavery created and sustained an underclass of people in our country. It necessitated a belief in Black inferiority to begin with, that we would treat Black people not as people, but as property. We know that the institution of slavery itself ended, but that belief system has not been addressed in meaningful ways. And so it has been perpetuated in the intervening years. We saw how segregation, the separation of Black from white as law until 1964, embodied and perpetuated white supremacy. And the legacy remains still significant today as we look across racial lines and see that very often we do not know one another as human beings, as individuals, as people. And that impacts our thoughts, our feelings, our behaviors. We see that intentional public policy was utilized throughout our history to systematically disadvantage Black people in housing, in education, in benefits, jobs, the criminal justice system, voting. And so what we know is that the roots of today's inequality are deeply embedded in our society. So if we know this, how does this history affect us? To begin, I think we would probably, most if not all of us, say that there is so much we never knew, so much we didn't understand. And I think we need to ask ourselves, why not? Why didn't we know this? Why wasn't it taught? Why isn't it being taught? What are the lessons for us in that? And this legacy of segregation in all social aspects, but probably most significantly in housing, means that Black and white, we are isolated from one another. And that isolation, that lack of personal connection, personal knowledge, personal interaction, eating meals together, spending time together, vacationing together, means that there is a natural degree of lack of understanding or empathy. And for white people, how difficult it is to know what it is like to be Black in America. Do we talk about it? Do we listen? Do we understand? Do we have opportunities for that kind of dialogue? And so if there is relatively little personal knowledge, something will fill the vacuum. That's nature. And typically what fills the vacuum are stereotypes, what we hear, what they say, what people say. And what we know is that the media intensifies these stereotypes through both overt and subliminal messaging. I think I have mentioned to this group that I took a class 40 years ago, benignly entitled Developing Effective Black-White Relationships at the DuPont Company. And the two Black men from San Francisco who introduced the class sought to set aside our personal defensiveness as white managers, our desire to explain that we were good people and that we did not discriminate. And they said, it is, if you grew up in the United States of America in the 20th century, it is not possible that you have escaped the degrees of prejudice that have been a focus of so much messaging from parents, from friends, from media, from teachers, from whatever. And we're going to talk about what some of those sources have been. Whether we have consciously caught the message or it's just permeated our thinking. If we've heard it, if we're conscious of it, we may be able to respond. But if we've absorbed it without being aware, we may not have had the time or the energy to address it. So what are some of those less visible messages? Here's a chart. It's from 2014. It is from New York City. And the blue bar is the percentage of suspects arrested for three types of crimes who were African American. Now, we know from our class on the criminal justice system that Black people are disproportionately arrested for various crimes. But having said that, that blue bar is the portion of people arrested for murder, theft, and assault who are African American. The red bar is the percentage of time that African American suspects were shown in media reports. So if there was a media report on murder, 74% of the time, a Black person would be the visual that you saw, the case that would be reported. In the case of theft, if there were a media report on theft, 84% of the time, the person being shown would be Black. And when it was assault, 73%. And so we hear these reports, we hear about these crimes, and we absorb the words, we get the message, but we see images that repeatedly tell us that it is Black people who are predominantly committing these crimes, well beyond even the arrest rates that are in effect. These are two screenshots from a news broadcast on March 23rd, 2015. The first report was about 3 University of Iowa wrestlers who were arrested, and there were burglary charges pending, not enacted, pending. There they are. And then several minutes later in the report, the Coralville police arrest 4 in burglary investigation. There's messaging there. Typically, you wouldn't see those two screens next to each other. Perhaps the differentiation would not be so apparent, but the messaging is quite clear. And whether we are conscious of it or not, we absorb it. It is part of the way that we gather information. And so, through this messaging, through the use and the acceptance of stereotypes in the absence of knowledge, what develops is something called implicit bias. It's automatic, it's unintentional. We're often not even aware of it, but it is there. And there is, I think if we stop and consider experiences we have had, we may see some of that. In my case, the class that I took, Developing Effective Black-White Relationships, very early on, after assuring us that it was natural to have some degree of prejudice, not to be overly concerned with it, the 2 instructors explained that while there were 15 white managers, DuPont managers in the class, of which I was one, there were also 2 Black people in the class. And the facilitators explained that those 2 Black people were DuPont employees. They had come from 2 different manufacturing plants in DuPont, probably in part because there were so few Black employees at the headquarters in Wilmington. but also to provide a perspective for us. And the facilitators explained that their experience in talking with white people in a corporate setting like ours and providing us with data, statistics, information, that our natural tendency would be to say, but not at DuPont. It may be that way other places, but it's not like that here. And so one of the roles that the two Black employees were to play was, when appropriate and true, to say, well, yes, indeed, at DuPont. And I will never forget, at a point in this 3-day class, when one of the Black plant employees told us that the local chapter of the Ku Klux Klan held its monthly meetings in the conference room at the DuPont plant at the invitation of the plant manager. As we began the class series, the two facilitators said to the white people, we're going to begin with language. We're going to begin with perceptions. So tell us, what comes to mind? What do you think of when you think of Black people? And we're going to write it, what you say, on a chart pad here. Well, there was an extended period of silence. I think we must have looked like deer in the headlights. But eventually, a brave white person spoke up and said, exotic. Okay, what other words do you associate with Black people? Athletic. Musical. Jazz. And then the facilitator said, oh, sorry, we didn't explain this process very well. We don't want to know what you think. We want to know what you have heard, what people say. We filled 11 chart pad pages with murderer, rapist, welfare cheat, criminal, lazy, stupid, undeserving. 11 chart pad pages. And the facilitators hung them around the wall. And then they said to the two Black DuPonters, what words do you think of when you think of white people? And they said, privileged, entitled, condescending, undeserving. Filled up about 2/3 of a chart pad page. And then they said to the white managers, how does that make you feel? How do you react to those words that they've used to describe you? And as the pushback began, I'm not privileged. I grew up poor. I'm not entitled. I'm sitting there and I'm looking at those 11 chart pad pages and those mostly horrific words. And I'm thinking, what must it be like to leave my house every morning knowing that the majority of people I meet, the white people I meet, are going to think some of those things, most of those things, about me. We know that studies have been done where identical resumes have been submitted for the same job, where one resume has a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant name associated with it, and another has potentially an African name associated with it. And the rate of response, the rate of callback, the rate of interview is dramatically different between the two. It's not the qualifications, it's the identity, it's the stereotype, it's the perception. I think it can fairly be said that in general, white people, particularly white people of a mid to upper socioeconomic class, are considered competent until they prove that they're not. Whereas the more general perception is that a Black person is not quite up to it, is not quite competent until they, sometimes surprisingly, prove that they are. For you white people in the audience, how many of you have a Black doctor or a Black attorney or a Black dentist? Is it a question worth asking? Is it because there aren't any? Is it because of a belief in capability? I don't know. But it's worth asking. And so for each of us to say, yeah, but I'm not biased. I mean, I know. I would suggest that you take a test. Everybody should take this test. It's offered by Harvard University. It's useful to take it whether you are Black or white. It will ask you. Implicit.harvard.edu. There are 4 or 5 of them, but take the one on race. And it has been taken by something like 25 million people. And there is a great body of statistics and information available. And it will give you an assessment of your implicit bias. And based on my own experience, I think many of you will find it to be a surprise. Just in case you thought the media had somehow not affected your perceptions. It's just human. It's just being human. But appreciating it, knowing it is so important. And so as we look at what we then do with that, we need to take personal responsibility, especially we white people. We need to confront and acknowledge our beliefs. And for particularly to white people in this group, I need to say that it is important that we get comfortable with being uncomfortable. It's okay. In fact, it's necessary. It's growth. I have heard people say, I'm uncomfortable dealing with Black people because I'm afraid I'm going to say something wrong or something stupid. Well, if that's the worst thing we do today, that probably isn't so bad. And so it requires some self-examination, looking at our attitudes and our beliefs, our behaviors. It's not easy. It's important that we engage in continuing education and dialogue, and that we share our thoughts, our questions, our knowledge, and that we listen for understanding, not to refute, not to rebut, not to explain, but to understand someone else's experience. Then consider what action is needed to help this situation, to fix this. What needs to be done? And then next, what could I do? Either by myself or in concert with others, and then make a personal commitment. This is what I'm going to do. So when it comes to self-examination, of our attitudes, our beliefs, our reactions. Each of us, particularly white people, need to observe ourselves in situations where race is a factor and reflect on how we're feeling or what we're thinking about levels of comfort, levels of involvement, levels of connection. And then when something happens, monitor our reactions. Be self-aware. I have been doing this type of work for 40 some years. I like to think of myself as evolving. But 4 years ago, my husband and I were in Washington, D.C. with another couple for the weekend, and we got a phone call from our twice-a-month cleaning lady. She had been at the house when a giant tree fell on the house in a storm. We came home, saw the damage that had been done, contacted the insurance company, got a contractor to come out and repair the damage. But the way the tree had fallen, it was a 100-plus-foot pine tree. It had wrapped itself into areas around the house, under the decks. And I had a significant concern that removing the tree was going to cause even more damage. And so I was sitting in the living room as the crew was at work when all of a sudden there was this tremendous thud and the whole house shook. And I looked up out the door and I saw that the crew chief was white, and I felt better. Didn't matter all the work I'd done. There's still these instinctive reactions. But the question is, what do you do with that? Did I recognize it? I did. Was I ashamed of myself? I was. Did I swear I would never share that story with anyone else? No. It's just important that we monitor our reactions and then reshape our responses. Of course, that was a ridiculous conclusion to draw. So continuing education for all of us is useful. There are books and videos, articles, museums. The National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. is a short ride away for many of us and an amazing experience. And the legacy museums in Montgomery, Alabama are extraordinary. There are classes like this. There are discussion groups. I could offer you a huge list of some wonderful recommended books, and I suspect you have some recommendations that you would make to others as well that help to expand our frame of reference, our knowledge, and they serve as wonderful sources for small group discussions. There are some terrific recommended videos. Race, the Power of an Illusion by PBS explains that race per se is a social construct. It is not biological. There is an amazing new Netflix program takes 2 hours. It kind of covers the 6-week course called Who We Are, a chronicle of racism in America. There are wonderful videos. Again, watch them with a group. Show the video at church. Have a meal, have a conversation. Some great articles, the history of the idea of race, the Equal Justice Initiative booklets, reports that have been produced, and they keep producing more. And then back in 2014 in The Atlantic, Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote an article called The Case for Reparations. It's free. You don't have to have a subscription to The Atlantic to read it. It's quite thought-provoking. Engage in more dialogue with more different people, discussion groups. Join one, form one. Join or form a book group, or if you're in a group already, suggest one of these books for discussion. One of the challenges can be developing cross-racial relationships because for many of us, we tend to operate, particularly we white people, in white circles. least social circles. So find ways to be able to engage in creating cross-racial relationships. And as we do, listen for understanding. And then speak up. Share what you've learned in this class series, share what you learn going forward, especially when people express racist comments. The path of least resistance is to say nothing and then get home and think, I could have had a V8, I should have said. And so I had a boss once who said, if you're anticipating a difficult circumstance, think what you would say or do, quote, out of the heat of battle. You may know a person and what something they've said before or are likely to say in the future. Consider and practice what you would say. That's not my experience, or I don't agree. I don't agree with that. Actually, and provide a fact. I used to think that, but I learned, or I read or saw this piece and I found it really helpful. Let me send it to you. So importantly, we can't fix all of this. We can't work on all of this, each of us by ourselves. So my suggestion is decide what issue most moves you. Is it voting rights, criminal justice or police reform, education equity, affordable housing, environmental justice, reparations, whatever? What have you heard during this class series? What have you observed in your community? What do you feel is a deep and profound inequity that you would like to do something about? And then join an advocacy group. Seek opportunities to work with other people to make a difference. And make your voice heard in personal conversations, in organizational leadership. Call your representatives, state, local, federal. Make your voice heard, your opinion known. And consider personal reparations. Seek out Black-owned businesses and do business with them. Restaurants, bookstores, jewelry stores, art shops, whatever. Seek those connections and build those relationships. Here are some of the many advocacy groups in Delaware: the Innocence Project, Network Delaware, the YWCA, Southern Delaware Alliance for Racial Justice. The list goes on and on. Some of these are broad-based advocacy groups, others focus in a particular area. Find one that's working in an area that you think is important and introduce yourself, connect yourself, get involved. So how did I get motivated, compelled to this class, this work? What got me off the couch were the deaths, in many cases, of unarmed people shot by police without consequence. And it's important that I say their names. Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, Alton Sterling, Stephon Clark, Botham Jean, Laquan McDonald, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Walter Scott, Antoine Rose, sweet Elijah McClain, Eric Garner, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Tyree Nichols, Breonna Taylor, Sonia Massey, and hundreds and thousands more. I never give this class that I don't add a new name to the list. The assault continues. So we're going to break into two discussion groups, the Zoom group and the conference room group and talk a bit about perhaps what this experience in the class has meant to you. What is your reflection, your reaction, your question, your commitment to help enact change? And then with about 5 minutes to go before our 3:45 conclusion, we'll come back for some close. I'm sorry, it'll be more like after 15 or 20 minutes, we'll come back and there'll be a short report back from each of the groups. Please select a designated person to speak. And then I'll take just a couple minutes at the end to conclude. So Mary, you want to shut off the sound in your room? And maybe you could even turn off your camera. I will ask the rest of you who are on Zoom, if you would, to please turn on your camera if you have one, so that we could engage in conversation with one another. I am going to stop the recording because this will not be part of the material that we provide going forward.